Um, I am going to actually teach with a slideshow friend, so it's a little bit easier to learn all this. I feel like once we have a visual, we're all going to be like, this makes a lot of sense. So while I'm teaching, I may not be able to see the Q&A, but at the very end, we'll go through all of them. So at any time you have a question or something is like, whoa, I had no idea, put it in the Q&A box so we can go through everything. Okay, so I'm going to click share my screen. Don't look at how many tabs I have open. Okay. View and present. Okay. Well, again, thank you everyone for being here live, or if you're watching the recording. I'm so proud of Kate for this amazing project and honored to be included. So let's demystify what your cycle even is, because it's more than just your period, and where we can start to begin in rebalancing any of the different symptoms that we might be experiencing. So as we go through this today, just remember that this is going to be probably illuminating in different ways, because a lot of us didn't learn a whole lot about our cycles. Sometimes I meet people that say, I didn't even know this thing was going to happen. I just started bleeding one day and I thought I was dying, right? That's kind of extreme. But most of us probably had a basic amount of knowledge and yet moved through that experience feeling pretty disempowered, pretty confused, and maybe have never really thought much about it until now, where now we're starting to experience adverse symptoms, or now we want to get off of birth control, but maybe our doctor's telling us that's reckless and you can't do that. How could you even think of such a thing, right? So my goal in this workshop is to really help you feel like you know your body so that you can always make informed and empowered decisions for your health. Okay, that's the basis of all this. So let's get started. So we talk about a menstrual cycle, and probably all of us consider your menstrual cycle your period, right? When you're actually bleeding. But it's really profound to recognize that your menstrual cycle is actually your full cycle. So 4 parts to this cycle. Your period is just one phase of it. When we think of cyclical health, we tend to just think of a period, but with these other 3 phases, there's huge significance there. There's a lot of imbalances that can happen in these other phases. And when we talk about ovulation, you'll start to see how ovulation is really the grand event of the entire cycle, and really the point of us having a cycle. So we have our period phase, of course, when we're bleeding. We have our follicular phase, which is that phase right after menstruation. We have our ovulation, which is when we might have a lot of cervical mucus. We might have a spike in libido, energy. And then we have our luteal phase, which is the longest phase. And don't worry, I'll go through all this in more depth here in a minute. But I like to break it down in this way with the seasons, because follicular, luteal, like, those aren't terms that you have to understand fully. But when we think about it in an energetic sense, then we really can recognize it. So if you think of your follicular phase like your inner spring, doesn't that make so much sense? After your period, it's like the world opens up again, life is good again, estrogen surging, and we feel really, really good. By ovulation, we're in that inner summer. And then this big transition happens between ovulation and our luteal phase, or our inner fall. In the fall, in a season sense, everything starts to pull inward, things are decaying and dropping. And we can feel that same way too. We can think of what symptoms are really common in this phase, like PMS and irritability and food cravings and being really tired. But when we think about that in an energetic sense, if that's our inner fall, maybe some of that is normal. Not these adverse, big things like severe PMS, but that coming inward kind of sensation. Interesting, right? So an important thing I like to point out is that as women, we are cyclical, which means we are meant to ebb and flow. So no one here is meant to be 100% the same every single day, though our culture, the 9 to 5, these things really ingrain that in us, that if you don't show up the same every day, you're doing something wrong or something's not working or whatever. So know that it is normal to have some fluctuations in your mood, in your libido, in your energy levels, productivity, but we don't want to see changes that are so big that it affects quality of life. So that's the difference. It's okay to be a little more sensitive sometimes, not normal to contemplate divorce half the month, okay? We can see the scale here. So this is what your hormones do in a normal month. Notice the big, beautiful ebbs and flows. That's the feminine. That's what it means to be cyclical. So if day one is your period, we can see how in that follicular phase, that inner spring, estrogen surges here. And in balance, estrogen is a happy, sexy, sultry hormone that keeps us feeling really good. And in the second half of our phase, and more of that luteal phase, progesterone is the star of the show. Progesterone in balance, again, is supposed to help us feel calm, balanced, grounded, not necessarily irritable. PMS should not be a big problem if progesterone is happy. Is that affirming for all of you to recognize that these waves are normal, just not extreme? So some of you, I know one person here mentioned that they're here specifically because they're wanting to get off of birth control. This graphic's really powerful and profound. So if you are on specifically a version of the pill, it's important to see this. So again, normal cycle here, notice the ebbs and flows. When we are on some variations of the pill, this is what it does to your hormones. Pretty wild, right? Some of you probably just stopped breathing for a second. Flatlined. To me, this makes me think of, in a hospital, someone's heart rate is being monitored and then they flatline, right? They're dead. So this is like flatlining our cyclical nature. Obviously, there's no ovulation happening here. And isn't it interesting that many people on especially hormonal birth control report feeling very blah, like I don't have highs and I don't have lows. I just feel like I'm here, operating at kind of like a mediocre capacity. You can tell me in the comments if you felt that as well. So we'll talk more about hormones in the cycle here, but if you're interested in learning more about birth control, there's lots of great resources out there to help you, again, make an informed decision. So throughout the month, the big thing going on here under the surface is your hormone fluctuations. So estrogen and progesterone specifically are lifting and dropping and moving around to prepare your body to ovulate. On a biological sense, reproduction is the goal. So whether or not that's your goal, that's what the body's purpose of all this is, right? Is to allow that opportunity for ovulation, which maybe will allow us to conceive. Now, there's a number of reasons why knowing just a little bit like this about your cycle is important. Number one, your menstrual cycle is considered your fifth vital sign. And maybe some of you know the other vital signs. They're like blood pressure, respiration, pulse, like basic things that determine if someone's alive. So it's really powerful to recognize this is the fifth vital sign. So for me as a specialist in menstrual cycles, when someone says they have irregular bleeding or they're not ovulating or their cycles are missing, I take that very seriously, right? Much more so than maybe other specialists would, because this is simply a new beginning, we could say, in medicine. We're finally recognizing how important a menstrual cycle is and what it really means when there's an issue there. And when we know our bodies, we can also determine when medical care is needed rather than how a lot of us have operated, right? Which is we don't know what's normal. So we live with these horrible symptoms for years because who knows? It's so normalized to have period problems. We can then look at things like PMS. We can ease period symptoms. And then these last two parts maybe are a little more spiritual than physical, but when we understand our cyclical nature, we have so much more love, compassion, and appreciation for ourselves and those waves we experience throughout the month. When we understand these changes, we have awareness and we can really start to understand our symptoms. Please recognize that your symptoms are just how your body speaks to you. So anything, period pain, a headache, joint pain, constipation, any of that, they're all little messages from the body. And so when we think about it that way, we're far less likely to just quickly numb it and a lot more inclined to really listen. Okay, so let's talk about these 4 phases we touched on initially so that you can know with amazing depth about your cycle. The next time you go to your gynecologist, you'll be like, well, I was on day 7 of my follicular phase. They'll be like, that's impressive, good job. Okay, so phase 1, period. I made this phase 1 because day 1 of your cycle is the first day of your period. So this, again, is that season of winter, and this can range from 3 to 7 days. We just don't really want to see it go beyond 7 days. What's happening internally is our uterine lining is coming off if conception did not occur. And so the body is really in a state of releasing and letting go. This is when our hormones are at their lowest level, which is why we all feel like what on our period? We want to sit on the couch with a blanket and a good book and some tea and not talk to anybody. That's fair in a lot of ways. It tends to be a reflective and introspective time. And it is the most important time of the month to really take care of yourself. Whether that's a half hour to yourself or a luxurious weekend experience, it doesn't really matter. The intention is what matters. So when we have an imbalance in this phase specifically, it can manifest in different ways. We can get more of the extreme sides of like heavy bleeding. We're going through a pad or a tampon an hour. It's very painful. We're in bed. Or it can be pretty opposite, where it's actually absent or it's super scant, or it's very irregular. So one month we might have a 30-day cycle. The next month it might be 45 days. We have no idea when it's coming. Big mood changes, again, while we're bleeding, or even just emotional exhaustion, or even the more physical sense of fatigue can be signs that there's something awry in this phase specifically. So after that inner winter, of course, spring comes, life gets better. And so in our follicular phase, this is usually 7 to 10 days. So on an internal sense, your brain tells your ovaries to produce FSH, or your follicle stimulating hormone, to say, get ready for ovulation. So we want to have that opportunity to conceive. Estrogen is surging as we approach ovulation, which supports us in feeling more energized. Our libido surges. We'll start to notice changes in cervical mucus, or we might feel a wet sensation. Again, this is when people tend to feel really good, unless there's a big issue with estrogen going on. So if there's an imbalance here, it might look like delayed ovulation or anovulation. That's when we don't even ovulate in a month, which is actually extremely common. A lot of period problems come back to that specifically. Low estrogen symptoms. So this could be feeling very lethargic or frail, hairs falling out. We can almost take on symptoms that look similar to a thyroid imbalance. And again, fatigue. So if this phase doesn't leave you feeling really good, we want to look at what estrogen's doing specifically. So then we come to the grand shebang of the whole cycle, ovulation. This is that season of summer. How do you feel in peak July, right? You want to be social, you're energized, you're having a great time. Ovulation is in itself only up to 24 hours. So an egg is only viable, a super healthy egg, up to 24 hours. However, we usually think of ovulation as a window because sperm can live in the body up to 5 days. And so this is where if you ovulate today, but you had unprotected sex 4 days ago, there's still a risk of pregnancy. During ovulation, your cervical mucus changes. At peak ovulation, it's very egg white-like, very goopy, clear, sticky. You probably all noticed that before. No one talks about discharge. It's normal, it's healthy. But that really fertile mucus especially is what allows sperm to live so long and to swim right up into the body. So how interesting is that? Again, biology has a purpose here. It has a big goal. So when your egg moves from the ovary into the fallopian tube, this is where conception can occur, is right there in the fallopian tube. On a deeper sense, when estrogen is surging, it ultimately will reach a peak point, and that at that point, the body stimulates LH, or your luteinizing hormone, to actually release the follicle and release the egg. If you are ovulating consistently, this will also signal your period to begin about 14 days later. So all of us here now, we have this interesting awareness, right? So now we know if we're, say, having a 28-day cycle last month, and this month we're having a 38-day cycle, what was the issue? It's not just like a random occurrence. It was probably 99% likely something happened here with ovulation. So either we didn't ovulate, and so eventually your body had a withdrawal bleed because there was nothing for it to do. You can still have regular periods and not be ovulating. Or ovulation was delayed, meaning something was going on. We traveled, we were stressed, we were sick, a number of things can affect ovulation. So isn't that interesting? Now, when your period is late, you'll have a lot more interesting questions for yourself, right? Like what was going on around that time of the month that would either turn off ovulation or delay it. So if there's an imbalance in ovulation, usually it's going to be just the absence of ovulation. I teach a lot about cycle tracking, which is where you track your basal body temperature and your cervical mucus so that you can confirm when ovulation does actually happen. It's great as a form of contraception. It's what I use for my own version of birth control. But even if that's not that interesting to you or that's not the goal per se, this is still fascinating to track because if we're not ovulating for a prolonged amount of time, future issues can arise, certainly infertility, but other things as well, like cysts forming because our ovary is never releasing the follicle. A number of things can come from this, like hormone imbalances as well. And then, of course, if that's happening, then we'll probably, our first concern is not going to be, I wonder if I'm ovulating, right? When people come to me, that's not what they say. They say, I'm coming to you because my periods are weird. But this is probably what's behind it. And then last but not least, our luteal phase. Our luteal phase gets a really bad rap, and I'm here to help you see that it's not as horrible as we may all think. Season of fall, and this is the longest phase of your whole cycle, 10 to 14 days usually. This can be a really beautiful phase of your cycle, but if there are underlying hormone issues or if PMS is a big problem, this can also be a hellish half of the month if there's a lot of issues there. So if we did not get pregnant, the egg, excuse me, transforms into the corpus luteum to produce progesterone and estrogen. So this big shift in what your hormones is doing is what some people consider PMS. So your hormones are changing really rapidly, which likely can create some mood disturbances. But again, we don't want anything severe to where we, hate our partner for 2 weeks of the month. Another thing that happens here that's significant, so if you have painful periods, listen closely. You have 2 prostaglandins that are also released during this phase towards the end of your luteal phase, and prostaglandins create contractions in the uterus. So this is what allows that uterine lining to fall off and then move out. So if you've given birth, again, you are very familiar with that sensation of the contraction to move something out. If prostaglandins are too high, we can imagine what that does. We get severe contractions or cramping. So if someone has severe period pain, this is one area we look at closely. And then, of course, the greatest question I have in my practice as a naturopath is why? Prostaglandins are never just high just because. We want to understand what caused them to go high in the first place. I often say my job is like being a detective, just figuring out what does this mean? So if there's an issue in the luteal phase, we might have really short cycles where we're having a period, say, every 23 days. That tells me a lot about progesterone. That tells me that the luteal phase is too short, which in turn may mean we're going to have a hard time getting pregnant. If you have really short cycle lengths, sometimes there's not enough time for, even if there was an egg fertilized, to make it all the way back down into the uterus. So that can be really problematic. And then certainly if we have low progesterone, the luteal phase may be, again, short, and that can also be a cause for the severe symptoms like PMS. Isn't this so cool? Are you like, my body is epic? I think that every time I talk about this, like what an incredible orchestration that goes on without any conscious effort. Most of us don't do anything, day to day to monitor stuff like this. We just observe it and think, whoa. How? So I know that was a lot. Hopefully your mind's not spinning too much, but let me tell you some starting points where if right now you're listening to all this saying, okay, it sounds like maybe progesterone is low for me, or I'm wondering if I'm ovulating, or I'm on birth control. Birth control in many forms like the Depo shot, the Nuva ring, many versions of the pill, those work by turning off ovulation. So if you're on those right now, you can confirm that you're 99% likely not ovulating. So when you come off of that, the big question should be, how do I restart that? But right now, in this moment, if you're feeling like there's something not quite balanced here, where do I start? So the first thing I would encourage anyone to do is start to track what you're experiencing every month. You can use an app like Life or flow. Those are some of the most common ones. Or a period journal. I just published my own period tracker. So if you're like a pen to paper kind of person, that could be an option for you. But then we start to notice the patterns. So maybe you feel like sometimes I'm irritable, but when we actually start to track it, we can see, wow, day 20 through day 25, I'm not me. I'm totally irrational. And I don't like that. And my partner doesn't like that. This gives us a starting point to see what is the body telling us. Notice the big changes you feel, and do ask yourself that genuine question of, is this normal, or is this a way my body's trying to speak to me? I feel like if we quiet all the external noise, we can hear that the answer to that question really clearly. Is this normal? Your body will tell you yes or no. Be kind to yourself. Remember that those gentle waves are normal, but waves that take away from your quality of life are not. So this isn't a time to get angry with yourself or think my body's broken. What's the point? Anything like that. Instead, be so fiercely kind to yourself as you begin this healing journey. And then lastly, I know our first inclination is to Google things, and then we're like, great, I have like tumors or something, we take it to that extreme. Before you do that, start tracking this data, and then in a perfect world, find an expert that can support you along that journey. So that way we're not dabbling in expensive supplements that may or may not work for you. That way we're not self-diagnosing or anything like that. We can get to the root of it much quicker rather than dabble with a lot of things. So remember, this is your fifth vital sign. It's telling you something about your health. And I would encourage you right now to choose to pick this new lens of, anytime I experience a symptom, I now say, what can I do? And my beautiful body, what are you trying to tell me? How can I help you? That's a nice reframe, isn't it? Okay, in a minute, I'll answer questions, but I'm on Instagram at Menstruation Queen, so you can come say hi and tell me you were here. It'll make me so happy. And I hope that you learned something profound. If you're here live, maybe in the comment, tell me one thing that you're going to take away from this that was unexpected, that you really, really needed to hear. Okay, in a second here, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then I'm going to look at our little Q&A box.
That was amazing.
Thank you.
Also, if you guys want to raise your hand, we can move you to like be able to speak and ask questions, or you can send them through the chat box. I know a lot of people have questions about birth control and cycle tracking. So if you guys want to start there, this next 30 minutes is just for anyone here to ask questions and be able to get some good answers.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm looking at what we have here. So yeah, friends, if you're here live, in these comments, tell me what was really fascinating to you. And then if you have a big question I can help with. Yeah, wasn't that birth control graph like powerful and yet depressing? Super shocking. Yeah. That's the thing. Birth control may have its time and place, and certainly never here to shame anyone's choices for their body. But I often think, man, if someone, when we were 13, 14, 15 years old, when we were put on birth control, had laid out the pros and the cons of how it works, I would guess some of us would have picked differently. I know I would have. I would have said, this is insane. Like, what? I don't want to turn off ovulation. I don't want to deplete my body of essential nutrients. But informed consent wasn't a thing. Great question, Emily. Let me move my Q&A box here. So if we're wanting to get off of birth control and transition to FAM, or more of a cycle tracking, a natural form of it, there's a few layers to it. So the first big question is, what led you to get on birth control? So if you got on birth control partly for contraception, but also for any sort of adverse period symptoms, so like acne, spotting, irregularities, or anything like that, then we definitely want to start to rebalance your body before you even get off of birth control. If you got on it just for contraception, then technically you can get off birth control whenever you want. The main thing is as soon as you get off of birth control, though, starting to track your basal body temperature. I use Temp Drop, which is an armband you wear at